And our special guest is Alexander Wolf, author and writer for Sports Illustrated, great magazine. And the title of this article is Abusive Power, Why Do College Coaches Continue to Yell, Demean, and Demoralize? That's yesterday's tactic. Today's athletes can't and won't take it. What's more, it doesn't work. Study after study shows the benefits of a more positive approach. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Wayne.
This all starts in I don't know if we call this an honor or dishonor, at University of Illinois. And there was a player who had an injury. And his coach, Tim Beckman, said, play with your knee and shoulder injuries. What happened from there?
Well, he unlike players of 15, 20, 25 years ago, he said, no, I'm not going to make a bad decision for my body just because I'm being hazed within the team, so he said, and I'm going to do what's right for myself. And unlike 20 years ago, he had social media to make his case, to say, in a series of tweets that I'm sure many people in your listening area are familiar with, he basically explained what went on, and it got amplified when other athletes jumped in and said, hey, that happened to us at Toledo, where Tim Beckman had previously been a coach. So there are recourses now for college athletes who feel that they're being abused to go public with it. It's a kind of empowerment that I think the college athlete didn't used to have. And then, of course, simultaneously with that, when you had what was going on with the Illinois women's basketball program, and that was something a little different. But these two instances in Champaign, frankly, were the things that caught our attention, and we thought we would take maybe a deeper dive into this relationship between the old school coach and the new school athlete.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're doing this, because I was playing football and basketball back when I was in school in the 80s, and I had some of those coaches. I had one guy who used to pick players up. He was 6'6". This was in middle school, and he'd drop them. He'd trip them by the seat of their pants in football and drop them. I guess that's an 8-foot drop, and then he'd spit tobacco in their faces. And this was Texas football, and nobody really thought there was anything wrong with it. That's how we were taught. That's what a football coach does. And that whole, very militaristic, and this whole idea of what a football coach in particular, and you see it in other sports, I saw it in basketball too, where did that idea come from, and is that changing?
Well, I think it's changing, if only because the athlete who's put in this situation just isn't willing to respond to it. There are alternatives. You see in the professional level coaches like Pete Carroll, who's gotten to 2 consecutive Super Bowls by being very positive. The other thing that we discovered, and I wasn't aware of the extent of it, but we have among athletes and non-athletes in college now enormously high rates of depression and anxiety. And a coach who uses these tactics is playing with fire. Plus, there's that additional thing that these sorts of tactics in any kind of employer-employee relationship, coach-player relationship, they don't work. Perhaps the most eye-opening thing about working on this was talking to a business school professor at Ohio State, a guy named Ben Tepper, who studies abusive leadership by vocation. Mm-hmm. And he's done his research. He says everywhere, if you control for the experience or the expertise of a leader, if they're abusive, they're going to get less out of their employees, excuse me. And he says that there's this deep-seated cultural response to yellers and screamers. We look at Bob Knight. We saw him win. We look at Steve Jobs, now the subject of this documentary, see him yell and scream and demean employees, and saw how successful he was, and we just assume that there's cause and effect. In fact, guys like Knight and Jobs were successful in spite of those tactics because they were tactically smart, or in the case of Steve Jobs, just had a visionary business sense or a design sense. So his research, to me, just fed into this. It's just not going to work with a modern athlete. Now, you could say maybe the modern athlete ought to be more tolerant of these sorts of tactics, but hey, if you're a coach and you're trying to get results, why do something that's demonstrably not going to get the job done?
Right, but the other end of the spectrum, you will have people who are old school, and I look at Steelers' James Harrison, who got mad, said he stripped his kids of non-winning participation trophies, and so you have people who are a little old school, and they all say trophies for just participating, and a bunch of wimps. They should be able to take what the coach has to say. Have we changed? Are we wiser or wimpier? do you think?
Well, there is that everybody gets a trophy mentality, and I have my issues with that, frankly, as a parent of kids in youth sports.
I personally don't like participation trophies. I'm not a big fan, but that's just my personal view. But I also don't like abusive coaches, that some of the ones that I had. So, but there are people, that whole old school, that whole attitude. The kids have changed. That the old militaristic kind of coach is what we really need, and kids just don't want discipline these days.
Yeah, but I think we're setting ourselves up for kind of a false choice there. Right? There's no reason you have to lower your standards as a coach or a teacher or an employer, for that matter. You should be able to expect the same thing. But, hey, demeaning coaching or leadership when you could, catch more flies with honey than vinegar, you might as well go that route. And the research is all there. Here's the most interesting thing that we discovered in doing the research for this piece. Down at the University of North Carolina, there is a psychologist who has a lab, and she has studied by using brain imaging and all sorts of fancy things I don't quite understand.
Yeah, retina for the eye too, for the eyes and as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we have all these great ways to measure the psychological response to these stimuli, and she has discovered that your perceptual field actually contracts when you're experiencing negative emotions, which means that if you're a basketball coach and you yell at your point guard for missing that wide-open teammate in the corner, you've just increased the odds that it's going to happen again. And it's sort of these basic, almost self-evident things about psychology that I think a much savvier coach is understanding and starting to apply. And out on the West Coast, for the last 15 years or so, there's been this movement called the Positive Coaching Alliance that makes resources available to youth coaches on up about these simple facts and what the research shows and how to get the best out of your athletes. Say, try to use five pieces of positive encouragement for every one piece of criticism, and that'll get you closer to your goal.
So it actually, a angry coach will decrease your field of vision. I'm hoping now that Tom Thibodeau's gone from the Chicago Bulls, maybe Derrick Rose will get his jump shot back. Maybe that was the problem. I don't know. But you know what was surprising to me, and I always thought this was ridiculous when coaches tried to do this, and it happened to me. I had a hematoma, and the doctor said, if you play football and somebody hits it really hard, it was blown up like a balloon, and they said you could lose your leg. And my coach actually tried to force me to play. And I don't understand the idea. Players don't play well when they're hurt, and yet these coaches keep trying to make players play hurt. And not everybody's Michael Jordan that can do that. But that seems to be a common thread. You look at, for example, you mentioned the softball coach Aaron Layton, who targeted injured players and actually said, "Don't ever get sick again, or I'm going to kill you."
Yeah, and that might be verbal hyperbole, but when you're dealing with college athletes where these rates of depression and anxiety are stratospherically high right now, where 14% of college athletes surveyed back in 2010 indicated that they strongly considered suicide. 6% had actually attempted suicide. These are NCAA figures that they gathered with their huge surveys of more than 19,000 student athletes at all three NCAA divisions, and they come up with numbers like that. Forcing young people to play hurt or trying out these psychological mind games, you really are playing with fire. And I hope, and this was a story, I came in pretty innocently to the story, and the more I learned, the more I was rolling my eyes. And perhaps, you work on a story like this and you hope that there's something positive to take away from it. And usually when I look at the NCAA, I'm not encouraged. I'm not encouraged with what goes on
right, yeah.
and the leadership they're providing to college sports. But they did one thing a few years ago that I got to tip my hat to them for, and that was to hire their first chief medical officer, a guy named Dr. Brian Hainline, who's from the Chicago area originally, and has an interesting piece of biographical history, which was that he was a tennis player at Notre Dame back in the day. And he actually left the sport, withdrew from school because he was depressed. And he came back on his own terms and eventually worked his way up to being the number one singles player there. But he is now probably hired because he's a brain doctor, and that's neurology is all what people are about giving concussions these days. But he's highly attuned to this whole issue of college athlete mental health and well-being, is very much aware of this problem, and he seems very committed, to my mind, to get the word out, to change his thinking in athletic departments so the student-athlete can benefit.
And here's something interesting I thought. You in your article, it said a 2013 Georgetown University Medical Center study asked 117 current and 163 former Division I athletes if they suffered from depression. And the study found depression to be more than twice as common among active athletes than those who had finished their careers. It's counterintuitive. You'd think people would be depressed. They finished their athletics, and now they're just living in the past, when in fact it seems to be, based upon the statistics, a sense of relief. Like, I'm through. I don't have to take this kind of abuse anymore.
Yeah, and the researchers on that study actually expected precisely the opposite. They expected exactly what you described, Wayne, that being out of the arena would lead to depression. And in fact, I guess if you can pursue your sport in a recreational way, you don't have to balance academics with athletics, which time management is a thing that more college athletes point to as a thing that has a negative effect on their well-being than anything else. They just feel overwhelmed. So I think there are a lot of lessons that first athletic directors need to absorb, then they need to filter it out to coaches. And I think most important of all is at the youth sports level, kids are given the positive encouragement so that when they run into something that's abusive or negative, they recognize it as that. And then they can walk away, or they can go to a safe place, a superior to that person, and lodge a proper complaint. The University of Illinois, if we could steer back to them, they seem to now be putting in place safe protocols for athletes who feel they have a beef to go and raise their issue.
Well, it's a good thing, because the NAACP study you cited, Division I, 31% of men's basketball players and 22% of football players reported that a coach puts me down in front of others, and only 39% of women's basketball players strongly agreed that, quote, my head coach can be trusted. And women's basketball, or women's sports in general, I would not have expected. Through my own ignorance, I suppose, having obviously not played it, it seems to be a big problem with women's sports as well as men's sports.
And more striking even in women's sports. And I think that might be a function of how we've acculturated men to sort of be these armored warriors and keep their emotions to themselves, and walking through fire is part of what makes me a man, blah, blah, blah. And that women are just more willing to say, I'm not going to put up with this. There's more of an instinct to have kind of a balance between your social and academic life on the one hand and your athletic life on the other. But those numbers for women's basketball were really alarming. Think of that. If 39% are saying that I don't strongly agree, I can trust my coach, 61% don't always trust their coach. And that's such a fundamental relationship, particularly for these vulnerable young athletes, and we know they're vulnerable because of these statistics on mental health.
Yeah, and there's so little recourse for these athletes. For example, what can they do if they quit the team? They have to wait at least a year to get back and start playing again. So they have to take it. It's a very unbalanced relationship with the coach. They have enormous power.
Enormous power, and of course the material value of a scholarship is 40, 50, 60,000 a year in some cases. So if you leave the team, you're walking away from that. So my hope is that just to balance up the power, maybe social media, as was the case with Simon Savjanovic, will help the athlete, and just this wider circle of awareness that these are issues and there have to be reporting procedures so athletes have a fighting chance. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that there's been this now movement toward guaranteed scholarships at the big schools. They're saying, oh yeah, we sign you to a scholarship, we're willing to see you through. We can't renew them year to year and put you at risk that way. But the flip side of that is if a coach is hell-bent on getting rid of a player, he has more incentive now, because the only way he can get rid of that player is to make life so miserable for him that he quits of his own accord. So that's what I'm hoping is not the next thing we go through before this abusive coaching situation gets involved.
The unintended consequences. Finally, your book, Alexander Wolf, your book, Obama Basketball, basketball that's due out. That's it. You know, he played in Punahou. I went to high school in Hawaii. We played he wasn't on the team at the time, but we played the Punahou team. And what's that about?
Well, it's a look at how basketball helped make him a 10-year-old kid in Hawaii. Not many black people there, sort of groping with his identity, uses the game to forge his identity, and then moves on to meet his bride through the game of basketball, and then introduce himself to voters through the game of basketball. And then in office, actually uses it to bond with the public and even to govern, and exploring all those things. The book comes out next month, and I wouldn't have thought that there'd be a book in it, but then watching him govern, particularly after he got reelected in 2012, there actually was enough. So between Hawaii and Chicago and points in between, The Audacity of Hoop is the name of the book. Oh,
that's pretty cool. That's a great name. Excellent name. Alexander Wolf, author and writer for Sports Illustrated, author of the upcoming book, about Obama and basketball, The Audacity of Hoops. I like it. Thanks a lot for being on the Wayne Besen Show today.
Wayne, my pleasure. Thanks so much.
I'll see you in just one moment.
The Wayne Besen Show.